Hello, my name is Emma Comstock-Reed. I am an 8th grade math teacher, and today this video is going to talk about kind of the big ideas for Unit 8, since this week students will be starting their first lesson of Unit 8, where the focus question is how can we find the area of a tilted square on a grid. So I suggest using the Open Up Resources Scope and Sequence guide at the start of a unit and reading it over so that you know what to expect, when new vocabulary will be introduced, and so that you have an idea of where these lessons are going by the end of the unit. So you can see here that this first lesson focuses on the standard of using rational approximations of irrational numbers to compare the size of irrational numbers and locating them approximately on a number line. That standard and the standard for the Pythagorean theorem are the big standards for this entire unit, and I'm going to move to the scope and sequence from Open Up Resources or Illustrative Math, which is where all of this curriculum is coming from. So let's look at the scope and sequence for Unit 8 and just lay the foundation for what we're starting this week. So here is the Unit 8 Pythagorean theorem and irrational numbers scope and sequence section, and I accessed this through Open Up Resources, and you can create a free teacher account if you have not already to get here. I'm also going to add a PDF of this section as an extra resource for this week. So you can see here that they start off with an overall description of what students will be learning and kind of like a narrative, so you can read that as you'd like. It splits our work into sections. So they talk about in the first section, students are going to be kind of thinking about area in terms of tiling. And then in the second section, students are going to work with figures shown on grids and use the grids to estimate the lengths and area in terms of grid units. So continuing some of that work from the previous section. And then in the third section, students are going to work with edge lengths and volumes of cubes and other rectangular prisms, and they're introduced to the term cube root and the notation you can see there, and they'll plot square and cube roots on the number line. Then you can see in the fourth section, the last section, students will work with decimal representations of rational numbers and decimal approximations of irrational numbers, and expand their work from 7th grade, where they used long division in order to write fractions as decimals, and learn that such decimals either repeat or terminate. So they'll build in this unit on their understanding of decimals to make successive decimal approximations of the square root of 2 and pi, which they'll plot on number lines, and that will be the end of this unit. The next section that I want to point your attention to is the progression of disciplinary language, which is really helpful for thinking about when new ideas will come up within the unit and how to plan for them. Okay, so here you can see that Illustrative Math divides the disciplinary language for this unit into explain, justify, and compare. And then you can see also that something like strategies for finding area comes up in lesson 1. Strategies for approximating and finding square roots come up in lesson 4. And it's a really good idea to anticipate the language that students will use for mathematical purposes, as it says at the top, such as explaining, justifying, and comparing. So you want to always start with students describing things in their own language and then layering the mathematical vocabulary or the precise terminology on top of that. So this section is very nice because it gives you an idea of in which lessons, which types of vocabulary and types of skills students will need to work on. And then we're going to look into another section from the scope and sequence. And this section is the new terminology section. And it says at the top, this table shows lessons where new terminology is first introduced. And then you can see that they have split the table into receptive and productive. So the idea is when the word first comes up under receptive, they should be able to understand the meaning behind that word by the end of the lesson. And then productive is what they should be able to use within the lesson. So you can see on day 2, students are expected to learn what the word square root means, and they should be able to use the term square, like to square a number, since that's review from a previous unit, from the last unit, Unit 7. And then similarly, you can see in Lesson 3, they're learning as new words, irrational number, and square root symbol. And they should be able to use the word rational number, since that's, again, something that they've learned in previous lessons. And you can see that the words that start out in the receptive column eventually end up in the productive column after students have had a chance to describe things in their own language and hear you as the teacher introducing that vocabulary for a series of lessons. So square root is introduced in lesson 2, and students should be expected, when you're doing your formative assessment, you should be looking for students using the word square root and using the square root symbol in their own productive language and writing. And I'll move down the table just so we can see all of the vocabulary. And you can pause as needed if you do not, for some reason, have access to the scope and sequence. Although, again, you can always make your free account to get here on openupresources.org. Here I am back at the top of the scope and sequence. I want to make one more plug for an idea for this unit, which relates to where it says the comparison can also be done by showing that there is a shape that can be decomposed and rearranged. For students to decompose and rearrange, it's really helpful to have access to manipulatives if you're in person, or virtual manipulatives if you are remote. So I'm just going to show you a website that is free that you can, again, create a teacher account for, called Mathagon. And they have a Polypad, which has a lot of different manipulatives you can use, and I think that will be useful to help students decompose shapes. So I'll show you what that looks like now. So this is mathagon.org/polypad, and this is just a place that I would suggest you have students go if they're working on decomposing shapes. You can choose to have a grid in the backgrounds and change the size of the grid, and then there are all kinds of shapes here that you can drag and you can duplicate. And then that's a nice complement to the unit so that students can actually show moving around an area and decomposing and recomposing it. I hope that going over the scope and sequence of the unit and looking at this resource for manipulatives was helpful. Thank you for joining me, and have a nice day.